G'day, ladies and gents, and welcome back to the Unprofessionals podcast. This is Unpro number 4, so we're finally ticking along here. Today we have Jon Coughlin, who is the creator and solo indie developer of games Roger Meatball and Cats Fly Helicopters, which is currently in alpha on Steam. And we're going to take we'll have a little bit of a talk about what's going on inside of the development side of things in our little section of the gaming community. So, how you doing, John?
I'm doing great, thanks.
Yeah, if you want to give us a little bit of a background on exactly what you do in detail, where you come into all of this, and I think we're getting a little bit of feedback there too, Debmate, as well.
Yeah.
Yep, I
Are
can
you sure?
hear a little bit of something.
Are you sure? Are you sure you've just not got the stream muted?
Maybe it's entirely possible. This is nothing if not.
it's
No.
uh,
That's no. I should be
or
muted. No, I'm muted. I am muted. I
you are
didn't mess
muted.
up this time. My fault.
Um,
Are you guys still getting feedback? I can try muting mics on my
I'm
end.
I'm not getting feedback on my end, so possibly your microphone might be a little bit too sensitive. John?
Okay. Let me see what I can. Let me see if I can fix this. Sorry, I thought we had it all worked out beforehand.
We
It
did.
always happens when I start talking. That's all right. Unprofessionals podcast. That is the entire point of all of this. It is laid back. It is perfectly fine. And
You can
if something,
chance that it's fixed.
yeah, if something doesn't go wrong, then clearly we're not
It's
doing it right.
so anyway, let's just get into it because it's fine on my end. We'll work it out from there.
All right, sounds good.
Yep.
Yeah, would you guys like me to?
Yeah.
Just
Go.
give
Go.
us a
Go into
rundown
it.
what you do and
Yeah. So you guys mentioned it. My name's Jon Coughlin. I'm an independent game developer. I live in Madison, Wisconsin, in the United States, and I have been making games professionally for about 2.5 years. And I was learning how to make games and making them sort of as an amateur, as a hobby, for maybe 4 years before that. And my professional background is in aerospace engineering. I have been an aerospace engineer in the missile, rocket, and winged aircraft space for a decade now. And my specialty when I was doing aerospace full time was flight simulation. And so when I started making video games professionally, the first thing that I got a paid gig for was making Cats Fly Helicopters, the game that would turn into Cats Fly Helicopters. And from there, it seemed like the thing that I was best at, or the thing that I had highest chance of getting paid for, was to make games about flight. And I love planes, and I love flight in general, and I really like flight simulation. So, so I'm cool with that, and I'm sort of leaning into it now.
Oh, very cool. The more people we can obviously get in the development space here is absolutely fantastic. Now, your games, they're an interesting mix. They do lean on both the game side, but they've got a heavy aspect of simulation behind it. So, for example, Roger Meatball is essentially a game about landing on an aircraft carrier, which is nowhere near as easy as it seems.
Yeah.
Go.
sorry. You go.
Sorry, guys. I feel like I'm cutting you off. Yeah, my background is originally in serious simulation, right? And I actually I had not started playing any of the modern serious flight sims, like commercial flight sims or consumer flight sims, until I started making these games, until I started making Cats Fly Helicopters, and then eventually Roger Meatball. I had just been playing. I'd been playing a lot of AAA games and a lot of indie video games for the past 10 years or so. But I had sort of strayed away from flight simulation, and I always kind of felt that I felt as a player, if I was really honest with myself, I'd probably just only play flight simulations. And so it was in wanting to learn about video games and the industry as a whole, I tried to, I guess for a long time, I sort of forced myself to just not play any modern flight sims. And then also to build up my skills as a developer, the flight simulation space just didn't seem anywhere near as popular or as rich of a place for potential employment to me when I was first learning how to make games, because it's way undersaturated compared to what it was in like the 90s or really early 2000s. So I tried to force myself to learn how to make video games that were outside of the flight space as well. And then it turned out that that the best crossover of my personal experience and my specialty as a game developer was not just making sort of generic video games, or I don't mean to say generic video games as if that's a bad thing, but
Just sort of like the run of the mill, the first person shooter kind of thing.
Yeah, I guess
platform or
I don't mean to. Yeah, I definitely don't mean. I don't mean to say generic in terms of the games themselves being generic. I guess I mean generic in terms of my skills. Like I'm just so much better at making a game about flight than I am at making any other type of game. And once I realized that, and also realized that there was actually a way for me to make money doing it, it seemed pretty natural for me to dig into it. And yeah, that's how I got into Cats Fly Helicopters and Roger Meatball. And the sensibility that I have, or the my sort of design philosophy for games about flight, is that I think that flight is actually more intuitive than it seems like. It seems like the video game development world as a whole seems to believe.
Think it is. Yes.
And yeah, I think the experience of flight and the experience of piloting and seeing a thing move through the air is more of a natural experience than video game designers often give it credit for in the sort of mass-produced consumer space. And so in both Cats Fly Helicopters and Roger Meatball, I am trying to build games that are grounded in simulation, but sort of still casual and accessible. And because I don't see any reason why we can have something like Gran Turismo that is played by most of its consumers on a DualShock 4 PlayStation controller, but we can't have a game about flight that has like any semblance of legitimate flight simulation exist on a video game console. That doesn't really make sense to me. You know, I think we can get a little bit more serious with our simulation.
Well, look,
I want to open up straight away. Sorry, I want to get this in here. Thank you. For God's sakes, thank you. All right. So you touched on a whole bunch of things there, in particular in regards to how natural it is to actually fly. And I've tried to explain this so many times in the past, and it's a really, really difficult one to try and wrap your head around, especially if you're trying to explain it to somebody who hasn't spent any time in the simulation space before. The one I like to use is Ubisoft flight games, or Ubisoft flight in any game, whether it be Wildlands or whatever. They cannot make anything feel realistic, and actually go so far as to go GTA, helicopters and aircraft in GTA.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the reason why they fly so terribly, so utterly crap, is because they try and simplify the controls down. And I try and explain to people, you don't need to. Flight isn't difficult. There's a couple of areas, if you want to do a game, that you would need to soften things up a little bit for the end user. Landing is one of the things in particular, where you might possibly need to simplify it a little. But the actual aspects of flight itself, and even takeoff and the rest, is not something that you really need to play with too much, even for the most casual of casual players. And the case in point that I like to use, the first time my oldest son ever flew a flight sim, he was 3. And he was able to fly a B-17 around with absolutely no problems whatsoever. He wanted to go left. He pushed the stick left. The plane went left. He
Yeah.
pushed it back to center. It went back to center. He wanted to go down. He pushed forward. He wanted to come up. He pulled back. And it took him about 10 seconds to work out how to actually fly the goddamn plane around without having to think about it. And I'm thinking, he can work that out that quickly at that age. Yet Ubisoft doesn't trust its gamers to work out those same basic controls for a helicopter on a console controller on one of their AAA titles, and so manages to completely screw it up trying to make it easier, which actually just winds up making it stupid. So,
well,
Yeah,
it is
I have a
Ubisoft,
lot of
so
thoughts
a
about
lot of things are stupid. Just
it.
going back to these controls, making games that you can pick up and play. That last couple of days I've been having a crack at Roger Meatball, and firstly, I'm shit at it. But secondly, it's just I picked up. I've been playing it with Xbox 360 controller. I just picked it up. There was no. I didn't even have to look at controls. I just picked it
Yeah,
up.
I mean, you're
and
probably already doing like landing patterns, right?
well, I haven't had that much time, and I've landed like 10 times or so and crashed the first 2 times because the controls are quite twitchy.
Yeah,
Once I
twitchy.
sort of once I got over that, yeah, it was fairly thing, and it was only on my very last land, actually just before we got on voice here for the podcast, I actually worked out, hey, wait a minute, I can actually take off once I've landed, and it was, yeah,
yeah, but
the kind of thing I can just pick up and go, hey, okay, I got 5 minutes here. Let's go crash a plane a few times, which is
yeah, but
great.
it is something that I really wish that more developers would pick up on straight away. Really something I'd like to see exported across the entire space is that sometimes flight isn't difficult, and trust that your players are intelligent enough to be able to figure it out, because it's really not that hard. And
Yeah.
I do think, Mags, that you need to challenge Mr. G.I. Hagues, Mr. Iron Armanium himself, to some Roger Meatball landings. Been a while since you dropped a hey Iron, here's some carrier landings.
There is a
I
plat cam on
dropped
the second screen, so you guys can call each other in.
I think it'd be interesting. I dropped that video years ago, and it still gets views. I should do another one. I should really go back into it and just that should be my next War Thunder video. My War Thunder video for like the next 3 months, since I don't do them very often anymore. Is jump on and just pick out all the new aircraft and start landing them on carriers, because that was my
That's a good
thing.
idea.
Let's do it together, because I'd like to have a crack at that in VR. War Thunder VR carrier landings.
Well, it'll be more interesting now, because see, back when I did that video, a lot of the heavy bombers and stuff at the time didn't have cockpits. That was pre-cockpit War Thunder. So, yeah, so some of the landings, I hated flying without a cockpit, but a lot of people don't realize that video, I did that on stick. That wasn't mouse control. I did that on a joystick. And I did that from cockpit view. The video was recorded in the replays, but I flew that from inside. So, yeah, I'd probably have to do it again, because I'm actually better at landing on carriers in Thunder on a stick than I am on mouse. Go figure. I don't get it. But anyways, yeah, I did it all that way. So now they've actually got cockpits and stuff in there. It'll be a hell of a lot more interesting. And I never did end up putting the is it the IL-70? No, TU4, the Russian knockoff of the B-29. I never did end up landing on that as a carrier, so I might have to go back in and actually sort that one out.
Oh,
That's fun.
But yeah, from the back to the development side of things. Yes, I absolutely love that philosophy. And like, how deep do you get into the physics side? I mean, obviously, coming from your background in aerospace, how much of that do you actually bring in? How much of the simulation is actually there? Is there any areas that you choose to soften, or do you try and keep it as hardcore across the board as you possibly can?
Yeah, so I also have a sort of philosophy or a philosophy when it comes to simulation as well. That the lesson that used to get passed around in my flight sim department when I was doing a lot more of it at my job in the aerospace industry proper was that um, you can only match the quality of output that you get from the quality of your input. So, like, if you have access to a wind tunnel and a high quality model of your aircraft, and you're able to go in the wind tunnel and test at every angle and get a bunch of data and pump that back into a simulation, then you're going to get a super realistic, or I don't, realistic's a bad word. I'm not going to use that because that's going to that's going to trigger the
Accurate.
wrong idea. You're going to get a accurate, but you're gonna be able to have a lot more fidelity in your failure states sort of right off the bat. But the when
I like the term there, failure state.
Yeah, well,
That pretty much
yeah, because
describes
it's
any mission that I fly out.
well, that's where people start to notice deficiencies in simulation, or at least assume that they're noticing deficiencies in simulation, is on the edge of performance envelopes of aircraft, because it's not real difficult to make an aircraft fly straight and level accurately, um, and it's not that difficult to make or to simulate an aircraft flying with small angles of attack and side slip accurately. It's when you get into super dynamic states, or when you get near stall space, and that's where you get all sorts of, or that's the hardest area to simulate, because those are the most dynamic areas of flight, and that's when people start to.
What that term, super dynamic state, what's that mean?
Oh, that was, I mean, dynamic state is just like, rapidly changing, and super dynamic state is just the way that is just super is just the word that I put in front of dynamic, and I just meant it's when an aircraft is most dynamic, or when the
When shit's going real south.
yeah, sure. It's when an aircraft is like most unstable or something. So whenever you have really high rates of change on an aircraft, that's when you get the least maybe intuitive behavior. But also, since the behavior of an airframe is coupled between, at a minimum, probably 5 different control surfaces, right? A couple ailerons, a couple elevators, and a rudder. But oftentimes even more control surfaces than that. That's when you get really weird behavior, and can be less directly predictable behavior, and that's when, especially anybody who has experience in an airframe is going to recognize that, like, this stall doesn't feel like the stall of the actual aircraft, and so I feel like I've gotten kind of a ways away from the question you actually asked me to begin with, but to hopefully bring it back, I realized, early on in making video games about flight, that I'm not going to have access to the same fidelity, the same depth of data that sort of describes my airframe as I had in my professional space. So when you don't have that, you start to you you have to decide which aspects of the simulation um, you're going to have fewer numbers driving, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
But on the whole, my philosophy to simulation in general is that if you are you're trying to simulate an experience more than you're trying to simulate numbers, and
Hmm.
I think that's a thing that can maybe get lost a lot of the time when you're either developing a simulation or playing a simulation, is that if you walk away from playing a video game and are able to, or and the experience that you remember uh, is maybe in line with the experience that like you would read in a pilot memoir or something, or the experience that you were expecting, um, then the game simulated
Hmm.
the simulated what it was meant to simulate. And so, um, for instance, in Roger Meatball, my goal is to simulate the decision space of landing on an aircraft carrier. I chose that scenario. It's fun to hear, Mags, that like when you hop into War Thunder, you just try to land all of the planes on the aircraft carrier. That's like the
Hmm.
exact reason that I made Roger Meatball as just a game about landing on an aircraft carrier, because it's landing on aircraft carriers is in every flight sim that has
Hmm.
existed. It feels like. I mean, X-Plane has default scenarios where you can land all sorts of weird planes on aircraft carriers. Like it doesn't.
Well,
It's
I
it's just a.
I
X-Plane
didn't
just off
know
the
that.
coast of X-Plane just off the coast. Oh, you'll love this one then, David. If you fly out between France and England on X-Plane, just to
Mhm.
the southern part of the English Channel, there's an aircraft carrier parked out there, and you can
Yeah,
choose to try and land anything you want on it. It
yeah,
just sits
yeah.
there. So I have tried to land 747s on that thing. I have managed to successfully put my C-17 down on that thing. And yeah, it just sits out there all day for you to
Mhm.
dick around with. Basically, it's just a fixture of the environment, a fixed runway that you can mess with. It's not quite as dynamic as I would like, but
No, no.
it's there and it does its thing. So and yes, I do have a habit of the second I find an aircraft carrier, I try and put something down. I think at this
Oh,
point I've
everybody
carrier
does.
tested every aircraft in DCS. Some people have been far more successful than I have. I've seen somebody who has managed to successfully both land and take off from the Stennis in a MiG-21 in
Oh
DCS.
my God.
I have yet to pull that one off,
Jeez.
but I don't think there's many planes. I actually no, I take it back. I haven't carrier qualified the F-16 yet, so I need to do that.
Fun.
Um, but I will do that. I will come around and try it down on the Stennis. So
Mhm.
I want to be there
because it's
Yeah, no,
fun.
tonight.
it's
And I'm not great at landing. I'm the first to admit when it comes to my landings can be a bit rough, which is a side effect of actually doing
My
the YouTube thing
my
because
landings
I'm
are
trying to
perfect
play.
every time, and there
Yes,
is no evidence to prove otherwise.
yes.
Shut up.
No, absolutely not. That last F-16 video with your Mirage landing just does not exist. It is no.
No, and
You
I'm
should never have asked me to not show that off because you knew that that meant that I was going to put it in there twice.
yes,
um,
it's like taxiing the FW190. It's just flawless every time.
it's but yeah, it's the my landings aren't great, but I still it's a side effect of doing this. I'm flying that many aircraft. I never really get any extreme amounts of time on any one airframe, so I never really truly learn them. And I'm
Mhm.
constantly trying to remember things and occasionally getting stuff mixed up. Trying to land a Hornet at Mirage speeds and because I'm the brains in another place. But it's still something that is fun to do and fun to try. So the second I find any place where I can do some kind of odd landing, I try and put it down. It's also a little bit of a a challenge thing on my end because my eyes are knackered. So I deliberately try and find situations that should be a pain in the ass for everybody to put myself in because I just hate the fact that there's any restrictions on me. So I'm a bit of a bastard that way. It's why I like flying at night and like flying in heavy storms. Nobody can see anything. Well, neither can I. So we're all on the same page here. So it's great.
We're all equal. Absolutely. I understand what you mean.
And if I can pull this off, you can. That's generally my thing on it.
That reminds me, I should make a mission for IL2 that's not only at night, but also inclement weather, stormy weather.
I'll do it. I'll do that. Oh no. If we're gonna do that, if you're gonna try and create a map for IL2, that's deliberately designed to piss off everybody that only wants to fly at lunchtime in perfect weather. You want nighttime, heavy storm,
Yep.
hard rain, fog at low altitude, and you want to turn the map markers off. Learn to navigate. Learn to use your instruments. Look in the cockpit. It's all there. If I can navigate the map in those conditions, you've got no excuse.
I'm so sad that there aren't more. There isn't a multiplayer space in IL2 that uses its weather, and even like uses wind. Like
Well, we do.
Every
We
single
do.
mission
That's great.
on my IL2 server, the Unprofessionals, has turbulence, has wind.
Okay, that's
not
great.
necessarily like a lot of wind. I do have different times of day in a lot of the missions. I do occasionally. I try and make sure that they're in there, but I get too many complaints. But I do make sure
that's the thing.
there's a rain. There's at least one mission in the rotation that's got wet weather.
That's great.
There is a whole train of missions that we've got set up for that server, and I've got a whole bunch of them that are just sitting there that we never put into rotation for DCS as well, that are less than optimal flight conditions. And every single time one of them comes in, Dead Meat gets complaints. It's not clear and it's not sunny, and my plane's moving left when I'm coming at the runway. What's going on?
And every time I
All the
just say
multiplayer
change it,
environments.
my response to them is always change your tactics.
Yeah, it's because, and it's actually been a thing for a really long. Something that annoys me from the space, and it comes down to the whole how realistic is realistic. You hear sim community members often. I don't want to be too negative on this one here, but they'll often complain about something not being realistic in a flight model or something, and a lot of the times these are completely legitimate. And I actually want to come back to the flight models a little bit later because a couple of things you mentioned before. But just jumping back onto this one, but then they go into a multiplayer server, and if there's anything more than a few light puffs of cloud that might accidentally disturb their vision, or they've got anything more than about 3 or 4 meter per second crosswind, they crack the shits. Oh, no, that's not realistic. In World War II, if enemy bombers were coming in and it was pissing rain, thunderstorms, and ripping 15 miles an hour across the runway, so much so that the plane was more sideways than it was forward during takeoff, you flew and you shot down those bombers. Bad fucking luck. They're going to drop bombs. Their bombs may not be accurate because they've got to deal with that shit as well, but they're going to be up there and they're going to be flying. So you fly. And I structure entire missions around that. Actually, I get complaints in my comment sections for flying night missions in DCS, which is why I don't do them very often on the channel anymore. And often when I'm flying heavy weather conditions. I did a video a little while ago with the F-18 where I was doing a ground strike mission in what was essentially a hurricane. And I got complaints about it because there
Wasn't
was
that the one that I
minimal
joined
visibility.
you for?
Yeah, you were flying me back up in that one there. There was actually complaints because from the video side of things, there was minimum visibility. And I'm sort of rubbing my temples going, so, okay, the blind man is flying in a hurricane and successfully completing the mission, and you're complaining about the minimal visibility out the windows. I can't see out the windows in the first place, so what am I doing that allows me to find the targets? Because I don't run target markers for ground targets, I only run them for the air. So how am I finding the tanks that I'm blowing up? That's the part everybody seems to miss. And that's the part that was intended to be shown. And it comes from this core section of the community that, well, it's not so it's a core section of the community, but seems like it could be a core idea on how multiplayer servers or any kind of flight server is run. Is that everybody flies at daylight in near perfect conditions. Everything is always optimal. And you can see that just jumping through multiplayer servers for IL2, DCS, doesn't really matter, pick one. The flight conditions are always near perfect on every single server. There's almost perfect visibility. It's almost always lunchtime with maximum range. Finding anything with weather is incredibly rare
Mm-hmm.
at all. At
Yeah,
all.
and honestly, some of I would say a lot of the most fun that I've had flying those sims online has been the situations where there was like serious cloud cover or yeah, like a low cloud ceiling or something, and people are sort of hovering over targets right below the clouds, and then you've got other people who, the astronauts who are way up there hoping to bounce somebody and they can't find anybody, and you're peeking up through holes in the clouds for people, and like it just changes the whole environment. And like I personally find asymmetry to be one of the more interesting aspects of video games in general, competition in general, because um, it allows for sort of unique tactics and people really digging into roles, and those are role playing is something that I also find really compelling as a designer and as a player. And so yeah, I wish there was more variation in the multiplayer space for both IL2 and DCS.
Mm. Yeah, it was something that we're trying to get into people on the server on this end because it's a hell of a lot of fun. And as you say, some of the best experiences I've had in flight sims have actually been out of combat. Um, it's been the moment. Like it's another thing that I do in DCS, and I sort of wish there was an option for it in IL2. I don't think there is at the moment, or at least I've never seen it. Is random systems failures. I fly with that on always, and
That's
too
fun.
much to people's surprise in multiplayer, I also activated on all the multiplayer missions that I have too. So I've had people that have taken off and just immediately had an engine explode because shit happens.
I
And some of the best experiences of that I've had have been on missions where I've had adverse weather. You got heavy cloud cover, there's rain, there's crosswind. It's generally not optimal conditions. And they maybe not be the worst out there, but it's not great. And you're on your way home. You've had, you may have taken a hit, and then you've had a cascading systems failure. Half the avionics in the plane aren't functioning. One engine's down. You're trying to fly on one. The fly-by-wire is barely functional if you're in a plane that has it in the first place. You've got a crosswind, storms out there, and you've got to try and make it home and land while navigating visually through a storm because half of your systems are dead. That is some of the best flight experiences that I've had. I'm on probably one of the more recent ones that I've actually had on channel was I took a SAM hit and had to drag. No, so it wasn't a SAM hit. It was anti-aircraft artillery, and I had to drag an F-18 home that was pissing fuel to the point where it actually ran out of fuel about 30 meters from the end of the runway. Just those kind of experiences when things are just not going your way and you're doing everything you can to try and bring the plane home are often as good and in some cases even better than the combat situations that you can find aircraft in. And some of those are just naturally created by just having the right weather conditions and the right situation and the right combination of things go very wrong. Anybody that turns all those options off and don't fly in those is basically denying themselves the opportunity to ever experience any of it. And I think that's a real shame. There's a hell of a lot of fun to be had there. I mean, it's the reason why your civilian flight sim communities, why they enjoy what they do so much. If you ask most people that only play combat flight sims, what is it that civilian pilots do? Well, they fly to A to B, and that's it. That's all it is. There's a reason why most of the flight sims that are on the market, your X-Planes, I think Flight Simulator 10 had it. I'm absolutely positive that Flight Simulator 2020 is going to. In fact, it's already demonstrated it. Has the option to activate real-world weather. So you have to deal with real-world weather conditions and real lighting, which is never optimal. all the time while they're flying, and having to deal with that adverse navigation, having to deal with turbulence, having to deal with massive crosswind storms, having to divert flight paths to try and get to where they're going because something is going wrong. And that's assuming they're just doing a standard flight from runway A to runway B in the first place. They've got all that to deal with. If you're doing some of the flight in some of the more complex areas and you're flying the mountains to do delivery to some backwater runway in the middle of nowhere, these pilots are going to run into even more issues, updrafts against the mountains. And these are all things that it's very rare to encounter in the combat sim area, because anytime you turn any of those options off, or anytime you run anything outside of optimal combat conditions, it affects people's ability to see the targets. And so they don't like it because they only see the combat in the combat flight sim. They seem to, often a lot of servers, I'd like to say that they forget the flight sim part. And that's the section that they miss.
I think there's also, I agree with you. I think the combat sim space in particular is dependent on competition, and people want to get kills. People want to kill things, and yeah, I think that is also what drives them to be less interested in in failure, in the and the humility and learning that comes with failure. I mean, certainly there's a ton of people who really enjoy it, but it is when, if the goal for the majority of your pilots is to get a high kill count or something, then it's going to be hard to throw people into an environment that, even if it is like evenly matched or something, makes them feel like they're somehow getting cheated, or that it's the game's fault that they're not racking up those kills. I don't know. My guess is that is the part of the community who get the most vocally frustrated about it.
Yeah. And yeah, like it tends to be something that pops up fairly often. Actually, it was just sort of occurring to me then, from the combat side, there's actually a lot that's missing as well. Adverse weather conditions can be very interesting for combat tactics. Even in modern aircraft where you have, IFF and radar. Like, radar's a wonderful thing, but it really struggles to tell the difference between an enemy and an ally without IFF running as well. But IFF is a separate system you generally need to manage, and you need to double check. So, with the right weather conditions that give you the lack of, or the correct lack of visibility to a target, if a hostile aircraft manages to slip underneath your radar and then pop up in the middle of your group, they know everybody around them is a hostile, but everybody that's in that group needs to start double checking one another to work out who is and who isn't, except on some of these aircraft that obviously have automatic systems, but who is and who isn't the hostile in the group before they start shooting. There's whole tactics that you can use in relation to the environment that you're flying through, and if you do have them all turned off, well, you miss the opportunity to be able to really screw with people in all the fun ways, or just to be able to disappear as
Yeah.
well. Just flick off your radar, flick your ECM off, and in a modern jet, drop below the mountains to drop yourself off the radar, and then just pull up into a storm cloud and just vanish in the middle of a fight. You can't do that if everything's clean and clear. And once you go back to World War II combat, where the IFF doesn't exist and there's nothing but visual identification of targets, things get even more interesting. It only takes a couple of good clouds floating around, and you can completely reverse the situation just by sort of knowing how to navigate inside of a cloud, and having a bit of a picture in your head of what you think the enemy is going to do, and a little bit of luck to make sure that they actually do it, to completely reverse a situation that would have been normally you being killed because you got jumped, and you suddenly dropping out of the cloud and finding your enemy is in front of you because they didn't think that you might loop around inside of it or use the cloud to your advantage. So yeah, I'm very much against turning off all these adverse conditions, because in every aspect, they are an aspect of everything. and not having them does negatively affect the simulation as a whole, in my opinion. It loses something when you take this stuff away. Um, yeah. Flight models. Now, we were talking about some of that before. Now I've actually got to think exactly. There was something that I wanted to bring up, and I've
Yeah,
completely
well,
gone off track on what it was.
we were talking about why DCS World War II aircraft feel like jets, the way that they fly through the air.
Mm.
Um,
We'll come to
sometime
that.
ago.
I've actually just remembered what it was though, and we were talking about the edges of essentially envelope modeling when it comes to flight sims
Mhm.
and how close you get on the end. I did want to actually extend on that a little bit as well, and I should have done this back before because it seems like from what you were saying that when you start getting to the edges of the envelope, the quality of this simulation begins to drop off. The reality is, and like I've spoken to a lot of developers over this over the years, and it may surprise some people, but this is entirely common in all simulations. Very few developers have access to wind tunnel data or high detailed data, particularly when you start getting into very advanced or very new aircraft, where a lot of the stuff is still somewhat kept under wraps. Anything active service military, once you start getting to the extreme edges of the aircraft's flight envelope, things start getting a little less detailed in regards to the information that has been released, even if there is information released. And because of some of the interesting laws, I think a few people may recall that there was a little bit of an issue with Eagle Dynamics and DCS and one of their employees a couple of well, almost a year ago now, I think, where he one of the employees, and I don't want to go too much into the details because I'm sort of working off memory here, but one of the employees got access to some documentation for an F-16.
Yeah, I don't think it was that long
Now,
ago. I think it was like
yeah,
in the beginning of the summer because it was like almost right before they started selling the F-16.
yeah. Well, I think it was a little bit before that. It's popped up a couple of times for it, but regardless, he got some information to the F-16 that in most NATO nations is completely legal to have, but it's actually illegal to export to Russia. And he had it essentially on a PDF going into Russia and got into a lot of trouble for it because the rules when it comes to exporting this kind of data, even though this data is on the internet, like make no mistake, nothing that he had wasn't on a shelf in the Kremlin right now. In fact, they've probably got a more detailed version of it. They've already got the information because it is publicly available and it's on the internet, but it's the fact of actually physically moving it from one place to the other goes into the violation of some laws that are really nasty in regards to exporting military hardware or military information. There's a whole bunch of really the kind of laws you do not want to cross that will nail you in all sorts of prisons for all sorts of extended periods of time. And he ended up bringing this through because of these laws, even though this information is entirely available to everybody. I mean, I've got a couple of PDFs on my computer right now that if I was to pick my computer up and jump on a plane and go into Russia, I would get put into prison for that are completely legal for me to have here. But because the product is exported across multiple nations, including nations that do not fall under the you're allowed to have this information, quote unquote, even though they've already got it. Developers can't use the information in these documents. They have to use the publicly released information. Essentially, they have to use the equivalent of the Wikipedia information to develop the aircraft. They can't use the detailed stuff because there's laws and regulations on it, even if it's declassified. So all developers have to do this to some extent. There is a point in the flight model where they are sitting on information and they might have really good information. Sometimes there is no good information for flight modeling. Sometimes they might be sitting on really good information for flight modeling, but they may not be able to use it. They may have to run with some more simplified numbers in certain areas because those are the publicly available numbers that are available to be moved around. And if they use any other number, they will have to write themselves out a list of countries that they cannot sell their product into. And some of these may be very big flight sim communities. Russia has a massive flight sim community. So virtually all NATO aircraft that you have ever played in things like DCS unless they've got special permissions for them, are likely running on inaccurate numbers. Like I know for a fact that the A10 Warthog module in DCS is not accurate. Its thrust output and a couple of other areas in its flight controls have actually been deliberately nerfed down, and this was because of the difference between certain publicly available information and the actual information, and there had to be a bit of a change in there. And there is actually a more realistic version of the A10C module that is in a proper flight simulation setup that's only for, I think it's actually used for A10 pilot flight training, that actually has the accurate flight model as an example that they could not release publicly because it falls into that particular area. So anything in the flight simulation space, particularly if it comes to military aircraft, you have to get really careful on what you use and what you don't use, because put the wrong piece of information in and sell it to the wrong place, and the US government could come in, shut down your company, and arrest everyone type stuff. Like it's the law that the as I said, I don't want to go too far into the details because I'm sort of running off memory here, but I understand that the law that the Eagle Dynamics employee sort of crossed over was basically the same law that he would have crossed over if he had tried to sell an F-16, like an actual F-16, to Russia. Like that's the level it plays at. They don't discriminate on what you're doing. Oh, that's a flight manual. That's a real aircraft. As far as we're concerned, the same sort of thing. Now, I'm hoping it was just a genuine screw up, and he just had stuff and didn't realize it. And I'm hoping he doesn't get into any more major trouble than he's already in, obviously. But that's the laws that involving this, like for international like arms trade laws. They've got some really nasty teeth on them. So flight sim developers in general, especially in the combat space, unless they're working on vintage aircraft like World War II stuff, anything modern, they have to be really careful about what they actually use. And because of that, virtually every DCS module you've ever flown probably isn't accurate when you start getting towards the edges of the envelope, because they can't be. They cannot use the proper data because it is not allowed, and they can get in all sorts of shit if they do.
Yeah, I think. I guess a couple things. The article that I remember reading about that ED employee
Hmm.
also said that the FBI was watching him for having solicited or requested F-35 and F-22 manuals.
Yes, there was
So
a few other things going
that's,
on there
I
as
mean,
well.
that's I, whatever. I'm not. I I have no idea how robust the reporting was on that, but that's pretty illegal. In the
Yeah,
States.
that is very much illegal. Yes, but there
Yeah.
is yeah, it's not just that side of stuff though. He
Right.
I as I understand it, from what I recall, like he may have asked, and that may have been why they were paying attention to him. But I don't think he ever actually had any. But he definitely had F-16 documentation. What was interesting is, as far as
Hmm.
we know, he wasn't actually part of the F-16 team at all. So he wasn't actually working for Eagle Dynamics, but they still had to make a massive, you know, do a thing like this wasn't for us. This wasn't for us, because it gets them into all sorts of dramas. I mean, as I understand it, getting the F-16 in the first place for Eagle Dynamics was actually kind of difficult because it's a Lockheed aircraft,
Well,
and
yeah.
Lockheed has
It
prepared
ought to
3D.
be.
They've got their own flight sim. Yeah, they've got their
Oh,
own flight sim.
well,
Yeah, like just from a flight sim development side.
I would be skeptical of. I mean, their flight sims make them, $0 compared to actual military hardware. So
Hmm.
my guess is that any major hesitation, or any major difficulties in uh, getting access or licenses to military aircraft is dependent on the effect it will have on the company's ability to sell, or the defense contractor's ability to sell actual military hardware. But also, to circle back to something you mentioned about the difficulty of getting high fidelity data for consumer flight simulations. We're talking about a lot of U.S. aircraft right now, but there's a pretty clear reason that ED is clearly stated about not having clickable cockpits and super high fidelity on the
Russian
Gen
aircraft
4
as well.
Russian aircraft. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, exactly the same thing.
Their parent country
Oh,
doesn't let them do that. So
yeah,
it's we
it
sort
works
of I
both
think
ways.
well, it works both ways, but since the market is primarily or I assume since they make most of their money on the U.S. aircraft, it is and also since they reside in another country, I think that they're putting out. I assume that they are more sensitive to the demands and expectations of the Russian government than they are of NATO countries.
Well, yes and no. They've got to play all markets, and like it is always Dynamics is headquartered in Moscow, so there's definitely some concern they got to have there on their end. But I like it's not like nobody would buy a Red 4 aircraft. For like they've been chewing on the bit for them for ages. It's
Oh,
just
people would buy them for sure. Yeah, that's sort of
yeah,
what I'm saying is
yeah.
I
Russia is a
I
little
think the
bit
fact
more.
that we have a higher fidelity bunch of NATO aircraft than we do
Mm.
Russian aircraft is not coincidental.
No. I think it's probably a thing, and my actual hope is I've got great hope for Decker Ironworks, because I think that's the only way we're going to finally get fully clickable Red 4 aircraft. They're not going to be Russian. They're going to be Chinese because China just doesn't care. So it's going to be a fully clickable J11. I'm hoping at some point in the future, which will be our SU-27, and they've got the was it the JF it's the current one JF-17.
17.
Yep. They've got that one that one in the which looks amazing. I have to add,
It looks
and
really cool.
yeah, it's some of the stuff they've shown it already. I want, please let me fly this. It looks like a hell of a lot of fun too. It's this tiny little sort of super modernized F-16. Basically, that's what it is. It's the Chinese equivalent of an F-16. And it looks like it'd be a hell of a lot of fun. But I think that's where it's going to come from because Russia's a little. Well, actually, no. It's you can probably actually go through and sort of explain why Russia would be a little bit tighter on their hardware as well. Like, if you actually look at the US aircraft. Pardon me. Look at the US aircraft that we actually have access to. We've got the F-18, the F-16. Except it's an older Block F-16. It's not the current version. It's not even close to being a Block 70, or I think what were they up to, Block 72 or Block 74 now? We're not even ballpark close to what's going on in those things. It's a much older model. You look at the F-18. It's the F-18C, an aircraft the U.S. Navy has put out of service. The Marines are still sort of flying at the moment in a couple of squadrons, I believe, but it's only while they're waiting for their F-35s. And even the other nations that fly them, which is, I think Canada's the only one that's continuing to fly the F-18 at this time. Australia is currently getting ready to sell off our F-18 fleet. Most of them are being sold to Canada, and the rest are going to be probably dismantled for parts. So it's an aircraft that is basically out of service in the United States, and it's on the verge of getting out of service. Now, what don't we have? Well, we don't have a Super Hornet, and I don't expect we'll see one of those for quite some time, even though it's a very similar aircraft overall. Um, yeah, I don't think we're going to get to see one for quite a bit. We're definitely never going to see an F-35 or an F-22 in DCS. That's just not going to happen. Forget about it. It's anything that is in simulation at the moment is an aircraft that is either old enough that it has gone through sufficient upgrades that it is no longer exactly the same as what you see in simulation, or it's an aircraft that's on its way out of service.
Mm-hmm.
The Russian
Yeah,
aircraft,
stuff that's not strategically relevant.
yes. Now, Russian aircraft, they haven't really updated their fleet with anything substantial other than the Felon in 3 decades. The avionics in the MiGs have changed, but there's still a MiG-29S. Like, it's still the machine that they've been building. I think the S model's been under construction for 2 decades at this point. It's still the same plane. The Su-33s, they're no longer building at the moment because they're no longer going to fly them off carriers. They're going to change over to MiGs if they ever get a carrier running again, of course. Assuming they can either get Kuznetsov to float again or they build a new one, whatever happens. But they were going to change that over to MiG-29s anyway. So the Su-33s are out of production. The Su-27s, the new models, are basically glass cockpit versions of exactly the same aircraft. They haven't changed the planes that much overall. So if you built a full fidelity, even an older block, let's say the equivalent of the FC3 aircraft that we have, if you built an older block Su-27 in DCS, that would be essentially the same aircraft to fly as the current model in service Su-27 that Russia has. In terms of flight capability, they haven't changed. Same engines, same tuning. The avionics is just a better way of displaying data, and that's all it is. And as far as I know, obviously, they don't release all their information on it, but they haven't really changed their data link systems at all. So it's the same plane. And my contact's just gone wandering around the inside of my head. So pardon me for a second, guys. Talk without me while I fix this one up.
So going back to something we mentioned before we started, you mentioned you were creating skins for IL-2, the I-16.
Yeah.
Is that something you do a lot of?
No.
The graphics side of things?
No, graphics are actually, as a
I'm going to have
developer.
to step away, guys. Keep going without me.
Yep.
All right.
Shit.
Graphics are my weakest side, which is why Roger Meatball looks the way that it does. I made almost all of the graphics in Roger Meatball myself, but that is like the bleeding edge of my graphics capability is to hop into Blender and make a low poly 3D mesh over top of a reference drawing and then just like flat shade it. That's pretty much all I can do. So the skins thing in IL-2, I didn't even know how to export a skin in IL-2 until this morning when I just watched a YouTube tutorial for it. But they have
believe they on the forums they actually have templates there for you to actually work with.
Yeah, so I downloaded the template and I kept like exporting it as the .dds file that you're supposed to do, and like it didn't work, and so I had to figure out like what in GIMP am I not doing properly to actually get the thing to export and be read by the game. But yeah, no, I'm just making this skin as sort of a joke for me and my friends. I fly with a few guys regularly, and we just hop on when people are available and hop into a multiplayer server. But TAW is starting up a new campaign, I think maybe tomorrow.
I could never get into TAW just because you have to register with their website, and
oh yeah,
having to register on a website just to jump on a multiplayer server. The way I fly, I don't have time to invest in something like TAW. So
it just to like I would love for TAW to be more full. So I will push back and encourage you to go to the website, because it is you just do it once and then you're in.
once each season, but it's just it's yet
right,
another
once each season, but
and it's
yeah,
just,
the seasons are like months long, and so if it takes you 2 to 3 minutes to get your name onto the thing, and then every sortie you have is a minimum of 25 minutes in the flight simulation, then to me it's a worthwhile trade-off. But it is a wild experience. I think TAW is the most impressive multiplayer thing that I have seen exist, or that I have ever been a part of in anything. So yeah, now that they're starting up a new campaign, that means that, I mean, the campaigns last a month to 2 months or 3 months, or I don't know how long they last, but it's months, and that means that I will be stuck flying not stuck because it's one of my favorite aircraft, but the aircraft available to me will be like an I-16 and a P-235 for a couple weeks now, and I really want a custom I-16 skin, so I'm just gonna make one that is based on the Pokemon Raticate, because the I-16's nickname is the Rat, and so I've got a really silly like brown skin with big teeth on the front. It's stupid. It's just dumb. But that's what I do with graphics. It's all out of I'm just like scraping together the barest of capabilities to put pixels on a screen.
See,
Oh,
for me, it's just TOW is just not like when I have time to sink into IL2, I'll either be jumping on the Unprofessionals server, my own server, because the missions are designed for what I want out of IL2.
Yeah, for you, absolutely, man.
All the
it.
planes are available.
Okay.
The missions are very ground attack focused. So basically, it's not very not very dogfight focused like a lot of the multiplayer servers are. It's not
Right.
it's not Airquake. It's a battlefield. There are AI vehicles, planes, and tanks on. Well, there's AI planes on every mission, but there's every mission that involves a ground battle. There's also tanks set up so you can actually jump in there and just jump on in whatever vehicle you want, even if you want to fly World War One aircraft. They're there.
Yeah, that's great.
And yeah, it's just if I'm not flying on that, I'm building a mission for it. So if I get inspired or get in the right mindset, because IL2 missions are not the quickest, easiest thing to make.
I've not yet figured out what anything in that mission editor means. So yeah.
Outside of the stream, if you want some sort of tips, and I can link you to the really tutorial.
Oh man, I might do that. Yeah.
It's once you get your head around how the mission editor works and how things flow, it is easy to make a mission, but it's time consuming. It'll take me weeks, literal weeks, to make a single mission in it. I can if there's a very specific that's a multiplayer missions. If there's like a very specific purpose, like Mags did a Night Witches mission in IL2 with a whole group of us jumping in HoTAS.
That's great.
And that mission was fairly quick to make because it was not complicated. It was just okay. Here are our takeoff points. Here's what we're gonna do. Is just place ground targets and boom, it was done.
It's great. You mentioned the Night Witches. I actually I think one of my stronger pitches, I'm looking to find a way to get a game with the sort of Roger Meatball sensibility funded for development. I think one of my stronger pitches is just to make a Night Witches game that is a narrative a narrative focused flight sim that is in the Roger Meatball engine. Yeah, that follows all of those ladies because they had a harrowing existence.
Yes, a very, 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 very interesting existence. I'm sorry about disappearing for.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'd definitely be interested in that. I'd definitely be interested in seeing something like that. Actually, in general, narrative driven flight sims would be fantastic. Like I would really like to see, and like just as an example, but something like Ace Combat, for example. Yes, I know the storyline for Ace Combat can be a little bit insane.
Yeah, it makes no sense. It's crazy
Yeah,
Japanese nonsense. Yeah, but
yeah, but It is story driven. Now, just picture for a second. I've actually been toying with the idea, and I haven't been following Ace Combat for long enough because I really didn't do much in the way of flight anything. Flight was always my PC thing. It was never anything I did on the console. But something with the for the concept of trying to completely recreate one of the Ace Combat games inside of DCS. I
Yeah,
think
I've
there's
seen somebody who did some. I feel like there is it may be an Ace Combat 5 mission or campaign or something in DCS that you can get on the user files. I don't know.
Yeah, there's a few missions that have been done, but it's actually recreate the entire game from as a campaign. I think, and you've sort of boosted my idea, and it's part of the reason why I'd definitely like to see something Night Witches orientated as well. Would
Mhm.
be, I think there is a hole in the flight sim games development for a long time for genuine flight sims. So not arcade games, genuine flight sims
Mhm.
with proper modeling, but with a narrative story behind them.
Yeah,
Like
no, there is.
why can't we have the Hollywood movie that actually has some um legitimate flight modeling and not arcadey stuff all the time. Yes, I know there would have to be arcade options in there just for marketing. Not everybody's going to want a hardcore flight sim
Mhm.
for their story. So like I get that, but having that option for
Yeah,
that experience.
yeah. So this is going back to the conversation that we sort of started the episode with, but
Mm,
the only reason that we there's no reason we can't have that stuff. The only reason that we
mm,
don't have that stuff is that there has not been a crossover between the flight video game space and the rest of the video game world. There are all sorts of
mm,
like let's you mentioned GTA a
mm,
while ago as a game that does flight pretty poorly, and I
mm,
agree. I really like Grand Theft Auto as a sort of like Zen driving game. Um,
mm,
because the driving physics in Grand Theft Auto are like an order of magnitude more legitimate, or more grounded, or more uh, predictable, like believable, like closer to the way that you would drive a car than their flight models are. And so I think the way that a decent portion of people play Grand Theft Auto is to like hop in and grab a car and like drive real fast and drive around and drive through the traffic, and the entire experience of that game is built for that. And so then they know that the core of their game, the strongest core of their game, is driving the car from point A to point B. So they build a game around that, and they fill the roads with other cars, and they um, fill the game with like random chance encounters and characters who could get in your car and say crazy things to you on the way. They give you
mm,
radios to listen to. They have, I mean, a massive part of the way that Grand Theft Auto digs through their plot or presents their plot to you is character to character conversations that happen as you drive from point A to point B, because they know
mm,
that they have a trust in the fact that their driving model is compelling enough to
mm,
convince you to drive from point A to point B, but you're going to develop enough of proficiency at it that you could also handle something in the background. So they let you handle that plot, that exposition, like that story development and narrative development. And yeah, the only reason that that doesn't exist in the flight space is that the only people doing good, like deep, robust flight in video games is the super serious flight simulation
mm,
people. And so you have games like DCS that have campaigns with voiceover and have some really fun and interesting missions with voiceover and stuff. But like, but that is still you could still take a game like Roger Meatball, like a level of flight fidelity that fits on a gamepad and still is seeking to replicate the experience of piloting an aircraft without forcing you to constantly like click around a cockpit and manage a bunch of subsystems that you sort of need a manual for.
mhm.
You can my goal is to like replicate the piloting experience, and now I need to find like some way to keep an average player, like a player who is not a pure flight enthusiast, interested in like flying from point A to point B, because there is going to be some downtime, and even if you put in weather and even if you put in other stuff, like there, unless you want to just design systems that are going to permanently flood the player with stimulation, which is not something that, or which is not a sort of philosophy or mission design philosophy that I adhere to. I think you can, you're going to be able to retain players through longer play sessions if you give them something else that's still a little bit softer to engage with. And I think narrative is the answer that I would like to use for my games.
Yeah, it's actually something kind of I sort of covered in one of my own videos back, flying around in the Huey, and I sort of addressed it then. And I keep meaning to go back to it as a subject, so thank you for giving me sort of the opportunity to go for it. But when it comes to narrative in a flight sim, it doesn't also. I think I would love to see something that's got a story, as mentioned, but it doesn't always have to be a story that is directly given to you. It can be something that you're sort of putting together yourself.
Mm-hmm.
What I
Mm-hmm.
mean is, what is the single most popular simulation in the world at the moment?
Is it like
Oh,
American Truck Simulator or something?
exactly. Truck
Yeah,
Simulator, American Truck
yeah,
and Euro Truck Simulator.
yeah.
The narrative of building your own truck company. And that is a game that, when you take away that little aspect of actually managing a company, the whole game is literally drive truck to place, pick up object,
Right.
drive to point B, drop off object, drive
Yeah.
to point A, pick up object, and occasionally stop for fuel somewhere in the center when you have to. Like,
Mhm.
gameplay wise, there's nothing, yet it is so compelling to do and so much fun to do, building your own truck company. Yet there isn't a single major flight simulation in even the civilian space at the moment
No.
that has an inbuilt career mode where you build your own own airline of any kind.
I would
It doesn't exist.
love a flight simulator that basically was, you know, for a truck simulator for flight sims.
Yeah,
That would give me a reason to actually jump in flight sims, because I, I I don't want to jump into a flight sim and decide for myself where I'm flying. I want to be
It's
given I want to be given an objective.
Yeah, it's good to hear you guys talk about this, because this is one of the models that I think I have a decent opportunity to get funded is the American Truck Simulator, Euro Truck Simulator of flight simulation, and I think that's a pretty rich space for
mm,
me to explore in an engine like I have developed for Roger Meatball, and it's why I've started to add it. I didn't talk too much about the game, so for people who
Well,
are
perfect
familiar,
yeah,
opportunity.
go ahead.
yeah,
Spruik your works, guys.
yeah,
Um,
perfect
yeah.
opportunity buried an hour in. I should have done that. I should have done that up front. But yeah, for people who are unfamiliar with Roger Meatball, I started the game as it was really a way for me to build my own flight simulation engine inside of the Unity game engine. So I knew I wanted to make games about flight, and I knew I wanted to make something about planes, and I always had envisioned eventually making narrative flight games, because I love. I mean, there's so many just crazy, harrowing piloting stories and so many great narratives in the history of aviation that if you have the flight simulation up front, and then you can, and if your flight simulation is inherently built to deliver narrative properly, then I could. My idea was that I could sort of make infinite piloting stories out of it. And so the first scenario that I decided to put into a game was landing on an aircraft carrier, because, as we talked about a little bit earlier, it's in every flight sim. And my earliest memories of playing flight simulations was sitting in my cousin's basement playing USNF Gold. It was like a Jane's game in the mid to late 90s, and
For
we
those
would
listening to the
play
stream,
it.
that's U.S. Navy fighters.
Yes, yes, U.S. Navy fighters, U.S. Navy fighters 97, U.S. Navy fighters 97 gold. Like one of those was the official title of the game we played. But we would hop in, and I mean, one of the instant actions that they had was land on a carrier, and you could pick your aircraft. And we always picked I think we always picked the Yak, which as a kid I thought that was really funny. I didn't. I was like, I always wondered why Russians name their planes after like a big furry animal, and I didn't realize it was like a dude's name. So yeah, like we were dumb kids. We had no idea what we were doing. We could never land on the aircraft carrier, but like you did it over and over again because it's like a 30-second game loop, and when you fail, you just restart, and it's always tense and it's always funny when you fail, and so we did that a lot, and I figured that was if I wanted to spin up a flight simulation. And I was doing this in my spare time. Like, I have a family. I had a 1-year-old kid at the time. I was only going to work on this, an hour to 2 hours a week at night, and I figured that was a small enough of a scope of a game for me to get something up and running. And so eventually I did get up and running, and people seemed to be having fun with it. And so I picked out like a name for it, and got the aircraft carrier part of it dialed in, I think, and then was interested in trying to turn it into a bigger video game. So recently, I've been trying to figure out what is a design for this game as a product that I can actually like market to people and that I could potentially pitch to a publisher and find funding for. And I'm starting to settle in on the aircraft carrier being your sort of base of operations, and because landing on an aircraft carrier is kind of always going to be compelling and probably a little bit harder than just landing on a big long runway. And
Don't be so
and then
sure.
yeah, that's true. They do always point into the wind, but they don't have to in my game. I'm making a video game after all. But yeah. So I making a flight sim that is sort of mission focused and gives you something to do. You mentioned that you don't like hopping in and having to like sort of design your own mission. Like nor should you. Like when you play most video games, you hop in and they sort of they outline a bunch of objectives and stuff. Like I would like my players to hop in and have like a bunch of different jobs to do, and that goes along really well with something like Euro Truck Simulator or American Truck Simulator. And so recently I've added in supply drops, so you can load up barrels underneath your wings and drop those, and they'll drop and parachute down to a drop zone, and you have to land them in a drop zone. And then I also just last week added crop dusting. So, you can go to these different bases. The idea is you go to different bases, you load up different payloads, and then you use those payloads to execute missions. And I need to pass the game around to enough people to verify that is a compelling loop for people. But I I agree if or I heard you saying that there isn't enough like mission focused in especially the civil
Yeah.
flight simulation space, and I think I assume that's what draws people a lot to like combat flight sims. I mean, they're not like bloody games, so I don't imagine that the violence is like a major draw, but like you do a thing with the plane. Your
Oh,
plane is a
yeah.
tool.
You get in, you jump in. Okay, so I want to go shoot these number of planes down. I want to get an ace in the flight, or I want to go
Mhm.
demolish that city, um, or factory, or destroy that gun position.
It's definitely part of it. I don't think it's probably the core of it. The thing with military flight sims, and I think what attracts a lot of people in, and it's kind of the reality of the situation, is the military gets the coolest toys. Let's be perfectly honest here. If the F-14 Tomcat was available to buy as a civilian aircraft, every frigate would have one. that would be everybody's dream goal. But unfortunately, it's not something that comes out. But the mission structure is definitely a part of it as well. Just it's not just having the coolest toys; it's being able to do things with the coolest toys. And
Mm-hmm.
and this is it baffles me that the civilian space in particular, because the civilian space has a ready-made environment for all the runways are in place, all the cities are in place. Everybody knows the flight routes. Like the flight routes are public for professional airlines.
Mm-hmm.
You have
Mm-hmm.
cargo drops. The entire world is modeled. You can fly literally everywhere. Everything you need to build a large scale, compelling, you flying Euro Truck Simulator is built inherently into every flight simulator that has existed. All your
Yeah.
Euro trucks, or like no Euro trucks, all your
Mm-hmm.
X-Plane 10, X-Plane 11, Flight Simulator 10. Microsoft 2020 is going to have it as well. In fact, it's going to have probably the most beautiful version of it. It's
Mm-hmm.
always been there, inherent from the word go. All the
Right.
weather systems are already in place. So all the gameplay and environmental mechanics are in. The only place I've ever seen
Yet there's still nothing to
a
fucking do.
yeah, the only place I've ever seen a career mode has been via mods that are a pain in the ass to try and set up because I've
Yep.
tried to set them up.
Yeah.
I'll tell you right now, I love my combat flight sims. I love playing around in the coolest toys. If you gave me a version, if Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 comes out and it has a Euro Truck Simulator build your own airline mode, you may not see me flying an F-18 for 10 months, 12 months. I might
I
just forget about combat flight sim for a little while.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's I think it's gonna. I think it will. So Microsoft is putting money into it. Microsoft is it's not the same Microsoft that was the Microsoft of Microsoft Flight Sim was a pre-Xbox Microsoft. It was a pre-video game development Microsoft, right? It was much more of a professional simulation focus. It was much more of like a sort of a dad simulation focus, right? And then it's around the time that they pushed out the Xbox and developed a games department that they put their flight simulator by the wayside and sort of abandoned. When they started doing console stuff, they stopped focusing quite as seriously on PC things, I think, and that is not that's not how they exist anymore. So
No, they've
if
moved
they're
a lot.
yeah, and like I mean they unveiled this game. They unveiled this game at a video game at an Xbox press conference, So like, and they're putting it on the Xbox and making it accessible on video game controls. So I just cannot imagine a situation in which they, as an institution, have such a great feeling of the pulse of the video games market that they wouldn't be able to see like those truck sims in particular, and the very very just minimal simple game loop that they have on top of like a core simulation as a reason for them to suddenly put this game onto consoles. I imagine that they're gonna try to make it compelling for people who honestly could not care less about like the startup procedure of a 737, but would definitely love to fly from airline to airline and then do all of the micromanaging of like the resource management of building up an airline, like you guys are talking about. That's as a developer, I feel like that's got to be what they're doing.
Yeah, I'm thinking they'd have to have that in there. Like, it's obviously not something you're going to put straight away, and not until they're ready to show it off. But I think you're right. I think it's something that they would have to put in. It's too big a thing to miss at this point, and too many large scale sim developers have missed this
But they
over the
just
years. There's no way they can miss
Well,
it again.
I think they're totally focused on I think they're totally focused on the existing audience, and these things are big and they're expensive and they're most of these sim developers that we're talking about are people who have existed in this space for a very long time, so they've sort of like narrowed down to a super reliable set of consumers, and I think they're sort of hanging on without being willing to take the risks of making something that might appeal to a larger audience, but also might alienate their existing audience. And that's my guess of why this sort of like a more mission focused or more game focused flight sim has not developed. It's just like what they assume is a risk, which like somebody like me sees as far less of a risk. Like I think flight is pretty compelling, you know, like, and I think you can, in the same way that there's like hundreds of racing games, I think we could have hundreds of games about flight and get people into them like really easily. It's just somebody's got to take the first step and make one that does it in a deep, rich way, but also can play on a gamepad.
Well,
Yeah,
one thing I've sort of noticed with any of the serious flight simulators is they focus so much on the flight simulation, so much energy on just getting the planes to look and feel right.
Oh yeah, it's like plane porn.
That they don't spend nearly as much time giving context to to why you're flying the plane.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you'll like DCS is the biggest example of it. What do you do in DCS? You buy your modules. Yeah, you'll learn how to fly the plane. That you play some of the built missions, but there's no.
And then you begin to troll the online services to try and find missions more.
Yeah.
And then eventually you just look at their sale trailers, which is just more plane porn, and you buy another plane. And they do a very, very, the Eagle Dynamics folks do a really excellent job marketing marketing their games, because their marketing materials are so gorgeous that their marketing materials sell the imagination of piloting a plane and doing a plane with a thing. But then you hop into the game and you don't do much with your plane.
Yeah, there's no world building in it. You're not
totally.
You're not. There's no story to follow. No reason to fly your plane besides just wanting to fly the plane.
Any reason you do find. And any reason you do find, it has to be one that you've made yourself. I mean, this has popped up all over the DCS forums as well. This is not anything new here that I'm saying.
No, totally.
Where is the dynamic campaign for DCS World?
Yeah. The other thing, like Microsoft Flight Simulator, X-Plane, what do? You learn your plane, decide, okay, I'm going to fly from this airport to this. I'm going to get up and fly.
It's exactly the same.
Yeah, there's no objective, nothing to drive you to play it besides your love of flying. IL-2 is better than the others.
It is. It's the reason that I gravitate to it more than
by a large margin, because they've sat there and they thought, okay, so we got these plans, we've got like focused on the Battle of Stalingrad, so let's build the campaigns, dynamic campaigns are a fairly recent thing, but they've built the world. You know what you're doing. You know what your purpose is. It's not just let's get up and shoot down planes. You're flying a Russian plane. You're trying to stop the Germans from fucking your shit up.
Yeah, IL-2 is a pretty like phenomenal piece of like history, with all of the. I mean, if you hop into their career mode and look at the just incredible recreation that they have of those historical campaigns, it's really impressive. But again, like we're sort of like we're digging into the details of a space that is like still pretty much entirely inaccessible to anybody who's unwilling to put in 20 hours to understand the nuts and bolts of these things. And they're still like even IL-2, with as incredible, IL-2 is the most interesting and compelling video game experience I've ever played. Yet, I had to get 15 to 20 hours in before like it even started to make sense to me, right? And it's still way less accessible than something like Rise of Flight, which has like a robust series of training exercises, which has like, does Rise of Flight have acted campaigns? I know that Cliffs of Dover had a really fun sort of acted campaign, that again still doesn't still is even like orders of magnitude less accessible than like every other video game on the market, and it is it's our biggest problem.
Yeah,
as
it's
a-
probably
as
the
a-
key reason why the flight simulation space is still as niche as it is actually less to do with it being an overly complex thing, like many seem to think. And I'm willing to bet more of a case of so what do you do in it?
I mean,
yeah
look at.
Well, we focus so much on making the complexity sort of up in your face and the first thing that you interact with, rather than we focus on making the complexity something that like adds depth to the experience, but making the experience something that is like understandable a lot quicker.
Well, we're getting about an hour and a half in, so it's about time to start wrapping things up. So
Yep.
John, where can people get your games?
Yeah.
A question I've got about Cats Fly Helicopters on Steam here. It's listing as an early access game. Is that actually available to download and play yet, or is it still?
It is available to download and play. However, you need to go through the Flipfly Patreon. So I'm developing that game. I've been collaborating for 2.5 years with a small game development studio here in Wisconsin called Flipfly. They made a game called Race the Sun is their biggest, most popular game. They also made a game called Absolute Drift, which is a racing game, and they recently released a game called Evergarden, which is a puzzle game. But we started collaborating on that a couple of years ago. They have a Patreon account where if you go and get into, I think it's maybe their bottom tier Patreon account, you'll get beta access to that game. And that game is still, I mean, we've been working on it for a while, but like, partially the studio has been working on other properties in that time as well. So the game is still pretty early, but it is. I didn't talk about it at all. Cats Fly Helicopters is sort of it's an open world simulated city with helicopters that have reasonable physics but very accessible sort of flight controls. And there's an option in the game to turn off the My Simple stability augmentation system and just get direct control over your cyclic and collective and stuff. So you can play it as a little bit more of a helicopter game, but you sort of just fly around the city and do and I guess help people. There's a hoist. There's a launcher that you can put on your helicopter. There's a bomber. There's a crate. There's a stretcher, and you go around using all of these sort of machine modules that you can attach to your helicopter to do sort of wacky things: fight fires, deliver pizzas, take people to the hospital, pick up and carry things around with your hoist.
Is there a cowbell attachment?
There's no cowbell attachment.
Okay, you won't get me in a helicopter then.
Yeah, cowbell attachment. Is that a thing?
It's
Is that a real thing?
It's more of an in joke for dead meat. Everything needs more cow.
Needs more cowbell. Okay. Yeah.
I don't know
I'll put that.
really
You know what?
I don't know if you've seen the Saturday Night Live.
I have.
skit.
I
Yeah,
have. I'm familiar with that.
it's a complete reference to that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like they do use helicopters to herd animals, so I wasn't sure if like there is. I wouldn't be surprised if or you wouldn't have surprised me if you said there was like a bell that they put on the bottom of a helicopter to assist in their herding. So that's why I was curious. But yeah, it's a lighthearted game. Imagine so the idea for that game is sort of like a non-violent, friendly Grand Theft Auto style game with a focus on helicopters instead of automobiles. So you run around in a third person, hop in a helicopter, and everything in the world is a physics object, and you sort of fiddle around and play around and do jobs for people. And yeah, it's pretty open ended. But you can get beta access to that at the patreon.com/flipfly. And then my other game, Roger Meatball, you can get at rogermeatball.com. Pretty easy. And then on Twitter, my Twitter handle is click2zoom. And I post about my games pretty regularly. I also post a lot about IL2, and now I've just the last like month and a half I've finally gotten into DCS, and I'm pretty obsessed with their helicopters. So a lot of garbage DCS stuff too.
Yeah,
Huey.
You're welcome.
I don't have a
welcome
Huey.
to
I have
keep-
every
Get the
helicopter
Huey.
except the Huey.
You
Get
need
the
the
Huey.
Huey.
Huey's the best one.
Is it the
Huey's
best?
the
Why?
best one. Oh, outrightly. Okay, for starters, you can put on, paint it black and fly over a jungle, and instantly everything in the world is better. But if you get past that, it's the most fun to fly. It's of all the DCS helicopters, it's the most I guess the best way to put it, stick and throttle. Yeah, everything
Okay.
else is sort of a bit, you're sort of you're dealing with an aircraft that has some kind of flight augmentation to actually
Right,
keep it
right,
up. And
right.
all of the others, the Huey has nothing. You
Okay.
are grabbing on for dear life and flying it around.
Yeah.
When you get it up, and it's so well modeled, you get it up to speed, and just like the real one, the dash in the Huey, once you start exceeding about 200 knots, starts shaking violently, like the entire thing's going to disintegrate. That happens,
Yeah, that's
and
great.
it sounds convincingly.
Mhm.
Also, it's got full swing loading capability and all your cargo loading capability. Everything
Mhm, mhm.
is for it, and has some of the best missions for it as well. So yeah,
Yeah,
get the Huey.
I mean, it seems like the helicopter that has the most
Mm,
content for
mm,
it. I love the Mi-8.
mm.
I love role playing, or how do I say this? I love role player aircraft. So aircraft that
Yes.
do specific things really, really well. And I also love like bizarre aircraft. And in that sense, like I just love all Russian aircraft. They're so weird.
So
And,
we're getting
Insane. Insane.
we're getting a bit sidetracked here. So yeah, so
all right,
Roger
sorry.
Meatball. So
All that
but
comedy.
speaking of DCS, there is an Unprofessionals DCS server that you're running on the open beta client. That you're welcome to join at any time. All vehicles are available on most missions. Yeah, and I do run a lot of missions that sort of focus on ground attack. So there's things for you to fly your helicopters.
Sounds great.
And on that note, if you want to support Mag so he can keep drinking coffee and whatnot, and feeding himself,
Please do.
Mags has the Magswear Teespring store, which has OK Boomer shirt is your latest one, I believe you've put up there.
Yeah, which has turned out to be insanely popular. And if you're interested in it, it will be up for a while. I'm not getting rid of it. There will also be, there's another P51 design I'm working on at the moment, and a Spitfire, which I should be finishing off in the next couple of days, providing I can get my videos in order on this end, that will be up as well. I want both of those up available for Christmas because they have been popular requests for some time and I've been falling behind on them. I also, and I haven't been advertising enough at the moment because I don't have enough up there yet, do have a disc plate that will be coming up that is also going to have another P51 and Spitfire design that will be unique to just disc plate going up for those looking for something to put up on the walls. Yes, that will be a thing. I will be doing a bit of expansion outside of the flight sim stuff as well into a few other sort of game inspired designs. Kingdom Come Deliverance will be having one soon, and of course, if anyone would just like to support me directly, I do recommend the Magswear store. I love the fact that people are buying a design, but otherwise, I do have Patreon and Subscribestar if you would like to help support the channel and just keep things ticking along because as you'll, if you haven't been monitoring YouTube at the moment, as I'm probably going to talk about in probably the next couple of videos, YouTube has lost its fucking mind at this point, and I'm not entirely sure how viable the platform's going to be for too much longer. So I'm sort of hoping I can find ways to get my money out of it so that I can still make videos on it, but not have to worry if they go up shit creek and be able to still survive. So be able to still making content. So anything you can do to support on this end would be fantastic.
Well,
Yeah, I think I shielded everything.
oh, well, thank you for joining us for the podcast here, John.
Yeah, guys, I
Yeah,
had a
yeah,
blast.
Thank you.
obviously you're welcome to hang around on this after we finish this podcast. But yep, this is the end of the podcast for now. So thanks for coming along, and it's been what we thought was going to be a shorter one has now been almost 2 hours. So so anyway,
It tends to happen.
it does, but you know, it makes for an interesting conversation. So thanks for coming along, John, and yeah, hope everyone has a good day and buy their shit.
Catch you later, guys.
Take care.